Netflix's Return of the King, The Fall and Rise of Elvis Presley takes a deeper look into tumultuous periods of the singer's life, including his notable meeting with the Beatles during a complicated point in his career. After graduating high school in 1953, Elvis started his music career with his first studio album released in 1956. That same year, Elvis made his movie debut, appearing in Love Me Tender. His star continued to rise, but his career was halted in 1958 when he was drafted into the Army. Elvis Presley spent 2 years in the Army, a period clouded in insecurity and worry that his fans would have forgotten about him. During that same time, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison formed the Beatles. Like Elvis, they attracted a younger crowd, at least at first. As the years followed and their popularity spread beyond the UK, it's no question that they became one of Elvis' biggest rivals during a time when every career decision mattered. What looked to be the potential for a powerful friendship in the industry went in a surprising direction. Elvis met the Beatles at his home in 1965. There are no photos documenting the group's only encounter. As mentioned in the Netflix documentary, Elvis Presley crossed paths with the Beatles amid his acting career. The meeting occurred in August 1965, when the Beatles were invited to Elvis' Bel Air home. The world was at the height of Beatlemania at the time, with the band enduring the travels of their third US tour. The meeting with Elvis happened on one of their nights off, and the 1965 hangout was the first and only time the Beatles came in contact with the king of rock and roll. At the time, Elvis' own music career wasn't what it used to be, and he was trapped in an acting contract that nearly derailed everything he had built. The Beatles, on the other hand, were massively popular, and despite being from the UK, their fandom in the US was growing by the day. There was an understandable amount of awkwardness when the Beatles initially met Elvis, especially since they were rising rivals according to the Beatles press officer, Tony Barrow, via BBC. The small talk turned into embarrassing silence, but that changed when the Beatles joined Elvis in what they all did best, play music. Barrow shared that music was their natural meeting point, so the awkward meeting became a fun jam session. Unfortunately, there are no photographs or audio recordings of the Beatles playing with Elvis, but Barrow stated, "It was an amazing session to listen to." Why Elvis called the Beatles anti-American? Elvis later turned on the Beatles. Elvis Presley shaking hands with Richard Nixon. 3 years after he met with the Beatles, the singer seemingly got his musical career back on track with Elvis' 1968 comeback special, the key event in focus of Netflix's documentary. The special allowed Elvis to go back to his roots, showing a vulnerable side of himself that many had never seen before. After returning to studio albums and live performances, Elvis sought out a meeting with President Richard Nixon in 1970, an interaction that led to Elvis labeling the Beatles as anti-American. Considering the meeting between Elvis Presley and the Beatles seemed to go well in 1965, it was surprising that the singer would publicly call out the band a few years later. Netflix's Elvis documentary briefly dives into how the singer avoided using his songs for political commentary and world events. However, he also avoided putting down fellow musicians who did take that path with their music. When meeting Nixon in 1970, Elvis had this to say about the Beatles: via National Archives, it was truly unclear what caused Elvis Presley to turn on the Beatles. Though, the feelings seemingly seemed from Elvis' crusade against hippie culture. The meeting itself was for Nixon and Elvis to discuss the country's ongoing drug problem and the increase of protest culture. Rather than voice his concerns and take a stance, Elvis felt the need to single out the Beatles due to their connection to hippie culture. What the Beatles have said about Elvis and his career. Some band members shared their thoughts on Elvis' comments. The Beatles leap into the air in Help. Elvis Presley's meeting with President Nixon in 1970 wasn't the only time the singer criticized the Beatles, doing so a year later while touring FBI offices. Seeing as the Beatles had been so vocal about the fact that Elvis was one of their biggest influences, it likely wasn't easy for them to hear about the criticism and blame he pointed their way.